Parents walked their kids to bus stops. Doors that had never known locks suddenly had two. Teenagers stopped wandering past the tree line. The woods, once a playground, became a boundary, and the Merritt farmhouse became something worse than abandoned. It became avoided. Law enforcement adjusted too. Patrols, night shifts, doubled. Deputies logged countless hours, revisiting the same dead-end statements. The problem wasn't effort. It was that nothing new ever surfaced. In a small town, secrets don't stay buried. Except this one did. Neighbors remembered seeing the children. Everyone remembered the truck. But no one remembered hearing anything. No shouts. No engine revving. No sound that explained 5 lives vanishing at once. That silence bred suspicion. People started measuring words carefully. Conversations dropped when strangers walked into the room. Old friendships cooled. New grudges formed quietly, without confrontation. Because if something like this could happen here, then it could involve anyone. Annual vigils were held. Candles lit. Names read aloud. Rachel, David, Emma, Eli, Matthew. 5 names that aged in people's mouths, even as the faces behind them stayed frozen in old photographs. Years passed. The original sheriff retired. Files were boxed, labeled, and transferred. What once felt urgent became procedural, necessary, routine. But the town never forgot. It learned to coexist with the unanswered children, grew up hearing warnings instead of bedtime stories. Don't go near that road. Don't go in that house. Be home before dark. No one said why. They didn't have to. Clay County learned that some truths don't scream. They wait. And whatever took those children had taught the town exactly how quiet it could be. From the start, investigators followed protocol. Always dual registered offenders in nearby counties were questioned. Transients passing through were tracked down and cleared. Tips were logged, categorized, and investigated, one by one. Every lead went somewhere, just never where it needed to. One man claimed he saw the children arguing with an adult near the farmhouse. Another swore he heard laughter late that night. A third said the kids talked about running away weeks earlier. None of it held up under scrutiny. Witness accounts contradicted each other in critical ways. Time, distance, direction. Under interrogation, memories shifted. Certainty dissolved. Then came the anonymous tips. A letter arrived at the sheriff's office in September of 1986. It hinted at a mistake and mentioned the farmhouse by name. No signature. No return address. Handwriting analysis produced nothing definitive. The letter was filed and eventually forgotten. Other names came and went. A former tenant of the farmhouse. Cleared by alibi. A hunter known for trespassing. No evidence. A local drifter arrested years later on unrelated charges. DNA didn't match. Each cleared suspect narrowed the field. And with each narrowing, the truth grew harder to face. Investigators knew something else too. This didn't feel random. The disappearance showed planning, control, familiarity with the land. Whoever did this knew where to stop, what to avoid, and how not to leave a trace. That level of precision doesn't belong to a passing stranger. It belongs to someone comfortable, someone local. That theory made its way through the department quietly. No press conference. No announcement. Just a shift in focus. But proving it was another matter entirely. In the 80s, forensic tools were limited. No genealogy databases. No advanced soil analysis. No digital mapping. Evidence that might speak today was effectively mute back then. The case stalled not because detectives stopped caring, but because they had reached the edge of what the era allowed. By the early 90s, the investigation entered official cold status. Active, but inactive. A contradiction that felt painfully appropriate, because the truth was still there, waiting. And the worst part was knowing it had been missed, not hidden, just unnoticed right from the start. Cold cases don't go quiet. They just stop making noise. By the Larkins file was thick enough to bend its own spine. Interviews, photographs, maps marked and remarked. Each page represented an effort, a question, a door knocked on too late or too softly. Officially, the case was inactive. Unofficially, it never was. Every few years, a new detective was assigned to review the file. Fresh eyes, same outcome. The story played out the same way every time. Promise, optimism, then the slow realization that nothing in the evidence had changed. But some details refused to fade. The placement of the truck, the calm of the scene, the farmhouse kitchen, Veteran investigators had circled those points decades earlier, writing brief notes in the margins. Unusual. Revisit later. Those words mattered more as time passed. Technology moved forward even when cases didn't. By the early 2000s, digital archiving brought the Larkins evidence back into the light. Photographs were scanned, old audio tapes converted, reports cross-referenced with databases that didn't exist when the kids vanished. Still, nothing broke. What had changed was the mindset. Investigators began asking different questions. Not just who could have done this, but how they managed to live normal lives afterward. How someone blends back into routine after something so absolute. The answer was uncomfortable. They didn't hide. They stayed. That idea kept the case breathing, even without answers. The file remained open by design, because once a case closes officially, it dies quietly. The Larkins children deserved better than quiet. And somewhere inside that file, detectives believed, was the detail that had been overlooked for 33 years. Not because it was small, but because it was too familiar. Physical evidence has a strange relationship with time. It doesn't age the way memories do. It waits, in storage, locked behind evidence tags and chain of custody logs. Items from the Larkins case sat untouched for years. Soil sampling, old clothing fibers, wood fragments from the farmhouse floor. At the time, none of it spoke. In 2018, that changed. A cold case review unit reopened several Kentucky files using updated forensic standards. The Larkins case was flagged almost immediately, not because of new tips, but because of an old note buried in an old report. Kitchen, floor inconsistent with the rest of structure. The farmhouse had been partially renovated after the children vanished. That meant something had been altered, covered, preserved, or destroyed. Either way, it was intentional. Investigators returned to the property with specialists, structural engineers, forensic anthropologists, ground-penetrating radar crews. This wasn't a search driven by hope. It was one driven by probability. The radar scan revealed a disturbance beneath the kitchen foundation. Not a grave, in the traditional sense. A space, hollow, sealed. When the boards came up, so did 33 years of silence. Beneath the floor was a concealed substructure, reinforced and hidden with care. Inside were bone fragments, deteriorated clothing, and personal items consistent with what the children had taken that morning. Time hadn't erased them. It had preserved them. DNA extraction focused on the least exposed areas of the remains. Bone, marrow, tooth, pulp, the kind of evidence unavailable to investigators in 1980-6. The results didn't answer everything, but they answered enough. The children hadn't run away. They hadn't been taken far. They had never left the farmhouse. For the first time in decades, Tech Assay wasn't asking questions anymore. It was making statements. And someone, somewhere in Clay County, had just lost the one thing that had protected them for over 30 years. Silence. Once the remains were confirmed, detectives returned to something they hadn't touched in years. The letter. It had arrived in the fall of 1980, just weeks after the children vanished. Typed, no fingerprints, no name. At the time, it felt like noise. Another cruel distraction in a case drowning in bad leads. Now, it read differently. The letter described the Merritt farmhouse in a way only someone intimate with the property would know. Not the layout anyone could see, but details hidden from the road. The way sound carried inside. The stiffness of the kitchen floor. The smell after rain. One sentence stood out. After rain. One sentence stood out. They didn't knock softly. Just after sunrise, federal agents surrounded a quiet farmhouse outside Clay County, Kentucky. The man they took into custody waved to neighbors every morning, paid church dues on time, and helped search for 5 missing children back in 1986. Today, he was arrested for their murders. And here's the question that still haunts this town. How did a killer hide in plain sight for 33 years, while standing at the center of the investigation? Before we dive into this chilling story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for the full investigation. In the summer of 1986, Clay County, Kentucky, moved at its own pace. Mornings smelled like wet soil and diesel fuel. Evenings belonged to porch lights, cicadas, and the distant echo of pickup trucks on gravel roads. It was the kind of place where nothing big ever happened. And if it did, people believed it couldn't last. That belief shattered on June 20-1st. School had been out for less than 2 weeks. The Larkins kids were restless, bored, hungry for adventure in that very specific way only rural summers can create. No malls, no theaters. Just Woods, fields, and old places people warned you not to go near. One of those places was the Merritt farmhouse. It sat beyond a bend in Buck Creek Road, half swallowed by trees, abandoned since the late 70s. Adults spoke about it in lowered voices. Kids, naturally, saw it as a challenge, a dare wrapped in mystery. That Saturday morning, the siblings loaded into their father's old pickup truck. Rachel took the driver's seat, proud and careful. David rode shotgun, radio already tuned between static-filled stations. The twins bounced in the back, daring each other to go inside the house first. Matthew, the youngest, clutched a flashlight that barely worked. They told their mom they'd be back before dark in Clay County. Promises like that usually held. By sundown, the porch light was on. By 9, it stayed on. By midnight, the phones started ringing. Neighbors joined the search before the sheriff did. That wasn't unusual either. In small towns, people don't wait for permission to panic. They grab boots, flashlights, and fear, then head into the dark together. By morning, the story had already grown tith. 5C1 truck. No sign of a struggle. No witnesses who agreed on anything that mattered. Just an empty stretch of road and a town holding its breath. As the day wore on, state police arrived. Then, reporters. 10 rumors. Some said the kids ran away. Others said they fell into an old mine shaft. Someone claimed they were taken by a passing drifter bought deep down. Everyone felt it. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Something had gone terribly, deliberately wrong. And whatever happened that summer wouldn't just define the Larkins family. It would quietly redraw the emotional map of Clay County forever. Rachel Larkins was 17, old enough to feel responsible for everything and still young enough to believe she could fix it all. Teachers described her as steady. Friends called her the second mom of the group. If the others hesitated, Rachel moved first. David was 15 and curious in ways that worried adults. He loved radios, engines, anything with wires. He asked questions people didn't always have answers for, and that sometimes made grown-ups uncomfortable. Emma and Eli, the twins, were inseparable, 11 years old, finishing each other's sentences, daring each other to be brave. They were known for laughter that carried across fields and classrooms alike. When one scraped a knee, the other cried harder. Matthew was 8. Keaton observant, the kind of kid who watched instead of spoke. He followed his older siblings everywhere, trusting them completely. 5 personalities, 5 futures. By the second day of searching, investigators realized something wasn't adding up. There were no footprints leading away from the road, no tire marks suggesting a chase. The truck had broken down. It had been parked neatly, engine cold, keys still in the ignition. Inside, everything was normal. Too normal, their backpacks were gone. So were the flashlights. Food double wrappers, usually scattered by the twins, were nowhere to be found. The sheriff at the time told reporters it looked like the kids left willingly. Parents in the crowd didn't buy it for a second. Children don't disappear together by accident. Not 5 of them. Not like these. As days stretched into weeks, the searches expanded. Helicopters circled. Dive teams checked nearby creeks. Volunteers combed miles of forest until their boots fell apart. Nothing. The absence began to speak louder than any evidence. Schools held assemblies. Churches prayed. Birthday candles were lit with no one to blow them out. Bedrooms stayed untouched, frozen in time, waiting for footsteps that never came. As months passed, the case cooled. Leads dried up. The media moved on. But inside Clay County, the missing kids became something else entirely. They became a warning. Parents locked doors earlier. Teenagers stopped exploring. The Merritt farmhouse went from local dare to unspoken rule. Never go near it. And every summer after that, when June rolled around, the same question resurfaced in kitchens and patrol cars alike. If those 5 children didn't come home on their own, then who made sure they never would? The Merritt farmhouse wasn't just abandoned. It was set back from the road and shielded by overgrowth. The property had once belonged to a tobacco farmer who left town without explanation. By 1986, nature had reclaimed it. Windows were broken, the porch sagged, and vines wrapped the siding like restraints. According to witnesses, the Larkins truck was seen passing Buck Creek Road just after 11 that morning. The kids waved to a neighbor. That moment would later become a fixed point in the investigation. The last confirmed sighting. The final normal memory. Investigators pieced together the timeline with professional caution. They established that the farmhouse was less than a mile from where the truck was recovered. Close enough to walk. Close enough to feel safe. That's what bothered detectives most. There were no signs of forced entry at the house. No blood, no overturned furniture. Just dust, old newspapers, and sunlight cutting through broken glass. If something happened there, it happened quietly, controlled. State detectives treated the farmhouse as a potential secondary scene, not the crime scene itself. They focused on opportunity. Who knew the property? Who had access? Who wouldn't raise suspicion being around it? Local farmers, hunters, land trustees. The investigation followed known procedure for missing children. They searched wells, barns, septic tanks. They checked utility records to identify anyone still maintaining the land. The farmhouse, officially abandoned, existed in a gray area of ownership, and gray spaces are where evidence likes to hide. One detail stood out early. The house's kitchen had been remodeled sometime after the 70s. Newer boards, different nails. Subtle, but noticeable. 2 trained eyes. It was documented, photographed, and filed away. Then it disappeared into storage. That detail would haunt the case years later. For now, detectives had nothing concrete. Just a place, a feeling, and a growing certainty that the Merritt farmhouse wasn't a random stop. It was the reason. The kids never came home. The truck was found just before sunrise on June 20-2nd. It sat on the shoulder, where Buck Creek Road narrowed into forest. North, brisk, no W, not stuck. Parked. The driver's door closed. The passenger window half down. The radio locked in static, hissing like a warning no one understood at the time to detectivists. That detail mattered. A running radio suggests interruption. Someone listening. Someone stopping mid-action. That kind of pause doesn't happen unless something demands immediate attention. There were no skid marks, no footprints in the loose gravel, no blood, no discarded clothing. It was the cleanest disappearance any officer on scene had ever witnessed. Search teams treated the area as a hot zone. They mapped every foot of terrain within a 2-mile radius. Canine units tracked scent from the driver's door down toward the tree line, then lost it completely. As if the trail had been lifted straight into the air. Investigators considered abduction, but 5 kids. At once, no witnesses, no sound reported by nearby homes. That theory collapsed under its own weight. They considered a prank gone wrong. Maybe the kids planned to scare someone, or explore farther than intended. But that fell apart too. Their personal items were missing, and children don't collectively abandon transportation without a reason. The road itself told a story. It wasn't a place people traveled unless they lived there. No through traffic. No shortcuts. Anyone stopping that truck would have known exactly where they were. That narrowed the suspect pool dramatically, which made the lack of suspects even more disturbing. The case logs show growing frustration among investigators. Leads were chased and cleared. Tips flooded in, then contradicted each other. The community wanted answers, and law enforcement had none to give. By the end of the first week, the tone shifted. This was no longer a rescue operation. It was evidence preservation. Clay County learned, in real time, what silence sounds like when it settles onto a road that refuses to explain itself. And 33 years later, detectives would return to that exact stretch of gravel, realizing the truck hadn't been abandoned at random. It had been placed. By the second week, Clay County stopped talking out loud. At first, everyone had an opinion. At the gas station, outside the courthouse, in the pews, on Sunday morning, people argued theories with confidence, because fear always sounds like certainty in the beginning. Then the fear settled in. Certainty in the beginning. Then the fear settled in. You won't find them unless you look where the house was changed. That line had been dismissed as guesswork, or imagination. With hindsight, it sounded like a confession hiding behind grammar. Modern analysts ran the letter through linguistic profiling software. Word choice suggested a local speaker. Rural syntax, familiarity, masked as detachment. The author wrote, as someone who believed time had already protected them. Investigators compared the phrasing to archived interviews. Dawson's, at first. Then, fewer. Certain patterns repeated. Certain pauses matched. The letter wasn't just revisited. It was reevaluated as evidence. What followed was careful, almost surgical police work. Detectives didn't rush. They didn't leak. They quietly rebuilt the timeline, placing the letter alongside property records, volunteer lists, and search rosters from 1980. That's when it landed. The author had referenced a detail not released to the public. The original plank damage, noted during an early walkthrough, a detail known only to investigators and one other group, the volunteers. Specifically, those granted unrestricted access to the farmhouse during the initial search. That realization reframed the entire case. The killer hadn't avoided the investigation. They had entered it. And suddenly, the suspect pool wasn't vast. It was small, local, familiar. The midpoint of the case had arrived, not with a chase or a confession, but with a shift in perspective. The person responsible hadn't run. They stayed close. Close enough to write letters. Close enough to wait. And close enough to believe they'd never be questioned again. There's a name that appears again and again in the margins of the Larkins file. Detective Harold Vance. He wasn't the lead investigator. Never was. In 1986, he was a junior detective assigned to logistics and follow-ups. Paperwork. Interviews others didn't have time for. The kind of work no one remembers until it's missing. Vance retired in 2002, but he never stopped reading. Every year, he asked for updates. Every few years, he reviewed the file again. Not officially. Quietly. At home. Highlighter in hand. Notes scribbled in a notebook. No one else saw it. He had one problem with the case that never resolved in his mind. Too much access. Certain civilians moved freely through active search zones. Too freely. No escort. No logs. It was common back then. Trust mattered more than caution. But trust can be exploited. When the letter resurfaced, investigators reached out to Vance. Not for nostalgia, for pattern recognition. He didn't hesitate. He pointed to a name, a man respected in the community, a land trustee with historic ties to the Merritt property, someone who organized volunteer shifts, coordinated search parties, and knew exactly where deputies were and weren't at any given moment. Someone who helped. Vance remembered the calm, the way the man answered questions without asking any of his own, the way he stayed late but left nothing behind. At the time, it didn't raise alarms. Now. It rang like a siren. Modern detectives paired Vance's memory with forensic evidence, property access records, old search maps, volunteer sign-in sheets. The pattern tightened. This wasn't about instinct alone, it was about consistency. The suspect's life showed no fractures, no arrests, no erratic behavior. That, too, fit. Crimes like this aren't committed by chaos. They're committed by control. For the first time in 33 years. The investigation had a direction that didn't end in a dead stop, and as Detective Vance put it, quietly, without satisfaction. We didn't miss him. We trusted him. By the time investigators returned to the Merritt farmhouse in 2018, it no longer looked like a place where anything could be hidden. The roof had caved in along the north side. Trees pressed against the walls, bending them inward. To the casual eye, it was just another ruin, slowly dissolving into Kentucky soil, but detectives knew better. Crime scenes don't disappear. They change. Forensic teams treated the house as a living record. Every alteration mattered. Every repair told a story. Renovations weren't improvements here. They were interruptions in time. The kitchen drew attention. Immediately. It didn't fit. The floorboards were newer than the surrounding structure. The nails were machined, not hand-driven, inconsistent with the era of the house. Under UV light, the wood showed signs of sealing layers meant to protect from moisture, or from something else entirely. Investigators cross-referenced renovation permits. There were none. Informal repairs were common in rural Kentucky, but this level of work required intent, skill, and privacy. Someone cared deeply about that. Section of floor remaining intact. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed next. Slow, methodical. Passas across the kitchen surface revealed anomalies beneath the foundation. Voids, reinforced corners, a space that shouldn't exist. Not debris. Not debris. Design in one grainy image, barely visible. A faint outline appeared in the kitchen floor, something officers had stepped over without noticing. That was the moment the house gave up its secret. It hadn't concealed evidence out of decay or neglect. It had been deliberately altered to preserve it. When investigators contacted the property trustee to notify him of the excavation, his response was calm, cooperative, predictable. Predictable. Search warrants were drafted, surveillance tightened, law enforcement moved quietly, knowing exactly how quickly suspicion can spook someone who's waited decades. The farmhouse had been silent for 33 years. Now, it was speaking clearly, and everything it had been hiding pointed not to a stranger, not to a drifter, but to someone who had helped decide where search lines went, and where they stopped. The boards didn't creak when they came up. They lifted cleanly, like they were meant to. Beneath the kitchen floor was a sealed cavity reinforced with concrete and timber. Not a basement, not a crawl space. Something custom built, measured carefully, and closed with precision. Inside, forensic teams found what the town had feared for decades. Bone fragments, fabric remnants, shoes reduced to shape and memory. Personal items weathered by time but unmistakable in form. 5 children, 1 hidden space. Investigators halted the excavation immediately. The scene transitioned from recovery to documentation. Photographs, measurements, chain of custody established before anything was moved. This wasn't about speed, it was about respect. Forensic anthropologists identified consistent trauma patterns across the remains. Not random, not chaotic. Controlled force, applied in a confined environment. The findings confirmed what investigators already suspected. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't panic. It was intentional. DNA specialists focused on preservation. They worked patiently, extracting genetic material from protected areas shielded from moisture and decay. Bone, marrow, tooth, pulp, material that had outlived 33 Kentucky winters. The lab results confirmed identities beyond any doubt. Rachel, David, Emma, Eli, Matthew. The official notification was delivered to surviving family members with care and restraint. There were no cameras, no statements, just closure arriving quietly. Too late and still overwhelming. But closure came with something else. Evidence. Trace fibers recovered from the cavity. Didn't belong to the house. They didn't match the children's clothing either. They belonged to a specific type of canvas used in agricultural tarps widely distributed in the mid-80s. Investigators cross-referenced purchase records. One name appeared, then appeared again. DNA. Analyses expanded beyond victim identification. Skin cells recovered from inner timber edges suggested prolonged contact during construction. A genetic profile was developed. Parshab at viable dotsits. Went indicadis. No hits. That didn't stop the investigation, because genealogy doesn't require perfection, just patience. With judicial approval, forensic genetic genealogy analysts began building family trees from distant matches, found in public databases. Second, cousins. Third, cousins. Branches stretching outward, then narrowing. The tree pointed home, right back to Clay County. The profile converged on a single individual, a man with land authority, construction experience, and unrestricted access to the farmhouse during renovations performed quietly, without permits, years after the disappearance. The same man who helped coordinate search efforts, the same man who walked the house freely while deputies took notes, the same man who never once asked how the investigation was going. Beneath the floorboards, truth had waited, and now that it surfaced, it carried weight no amount of reputation could withstand. What happened next would shake Clay County to its foundation, because the man responsible hadn't vanished. He'd aged, he'd prospered, he'd remained trusted, and his arrest was no longer a question of if, only when. When detectives finally said the name out loud, the room went silent. Not because it was unfamiliar, because it was too familiar. The suspect wasn't a drifter, or a fugitive, or a shadow from outside the county. He was someone whose face appeared in old search photographs, someone quoted in early newspaper clippings, someone who stood shoulder to shoulder with grieving families and promised to help bring the children home. His name had never been circled in red. It had been underlined in trust. Investigators moved carefully from that moment forward. Reputation is not evidence, and decades-old cases demand precision. Every step had to be airtight. No shortcuts, no assumptions. They rebuilt the suspect's timeline from 1986 forward. Property, transactions, renovation activity, financial records, travelogues. Nothing dramatic at first glance. No arrests, no instability. That consistency mattered. People capable of long-term concealment don't live recklessly. They build routines. They become dependable, invisible through reliability. Detectives compared the suspect's handwriting to the anonymous letter. Not identical, but consistent enough to justify further examination. Linguistic experts noted similar phrasing patterns, the same regional syntax, the same emotional distance. Then came the DNA confirmation. Investigators obtained a covert sample using standard legal procedure. A drinking glass discarded at a public event, perfectly legal. Perfectly sufficient. The lab results removed all remaining dough. The genetic profile recovered beneath the farmhouse matched. The killer had a name and a history and a community that trusted him completely. Before the arrest, prosecutors reviewed everything twice. Then, again, chain of custody. Warrant integrity. Genealogical methodology. Defense scenarios anticipated before they could be raised. This wasn't just about making an arrest. It was about making it last. When the warrant was signed, word didn't leak. Not to the press. Not to town officials. Only a handful of people knew what was coming, and none of them were prepared for what it would do to Clay County. Because the truth wasn't just horrifying, it was personal. The man responsible had lived among them for over 3 decades. He attended their events, managed their land, helped search for the very children he had already hidden. Beneath the floor, justice didn't arrive loudly. It arrived with paperwork, handcuffs, and a realization that cut deeper than anger. The monster hadn't come from outside. He had been standing right there the entire time. The arrest happened quietly, the way serious things often do. Just after sunrise, unmarked vehicles rolled onto the gravel drive of the farmhouse outside town. No sirens, no lights, only the sound of tires crunching rock, the same sound neighbors had heard for decades without noticing. Federal agents knocked once. The man who answered looked confused, not afraid. He wore work boots, a clean shirt, the uniform of someone who expected another ordinary morning. When they read the warrant, he didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He already knew. Handcuffs clicked shut, and with that sound, Clay County's past came rushing forward. News spread faster than law enforcement ever could have predicted. A deputy's radio crackled at the gas station. A cousin called a cousin. By noon, everyone knew who had been arrested, and no one believed it at first. This was the man who helped organize fundraisers, the man who knew land boundaries by memory, the man who had comforted families during candlelight vigils. Reporters descended by old photos resurfaced. Search images from 1986 showed him in the background. Always present, never centered. Always present, never centered. Neighbors gathered behind police tape, stunned into stillness. Some cried. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few grew angry, not at the arrest, but at themselves. How did we miss this? Investigators anticipated that question. They held a brief press conference, careful and restrained. They spoke about evidence, about DNA, about genealogy and decades of patience. They did not speak about betrayal, but the town felt it anyway. For 33 years, people had shared meals with a killer without knowing it, trusted him with property, with access, with authority. That realization fractured something fundamental. Schools locked down early that day. Churches opened their doors. Families sat together in silence, replaying memories with new, unbearable context. The arrest didn't bring celebration, it brought clarity. And clarity, in a case like this, carries weight heavier than grief, because Clay County finally understood the truth it had lived beside for 3 decades. Evil doesn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes, it helps you look for the light. The courtroom wasn't packed on the first day. There were no theatrics, no shouting, no dramatic gestures. Just a judge, a prosecution team armed with decades of evidence, and a defendant who no longer looked surprised by anything. Prosecutors laid the case out carefully. They didn't rush. They didn't rely on emotion. They relied on science. The concealed structure beneath the farmhouse, the forensic match from bone marrow DNA, the genealogical trail that eliminated every other possibility. Each point tightened the narrative. The defense tried to challenge the timeline, then the methodology, then the intent. None of it. The evidence didn't contradict. It reinforced itself. Halfway through the proceedings, something unexpected happened. The defendant asked to speak. His statement was brief, controlled, devoid of remorse, but heavy with finality. He didn't describe what he'd done. He didn't explain why. He simply confirmed it. A quiet admission, delivered without drama, carried more impact than any confession screamed into a microphone ever could. Families of the victims sat together as the weight of 33 years finally settled into shape. Not relief, not peace, but certainty. The judge accepted the plea. Sentencing followed swiftly. Life, imprisonment, no parole, no appeals, built on doubt. As the gavel fell, there was no applause, no gasp, just the sound of a chapter closing. For the first time since the Larkins case was no longer a question mark. It was a statement, and nothing, no reputation, no time. No silence had been enough to outrun the truth. When the courtroom doors finally closed, Clay County didn't return to normal. It couldn't. The arrest and conviction didn't just solve a case. They rewired how law enforcement and the public understand long-term evil. This wasn't a crime stopped by a tip or a confession. It was ended by patience, data, and a willingness to question old assumptions. For investigators nationwide, the case became a reference point. Training seminars cited it. Cold case units revisited evidence they once believed was exhausted. Boxers sealed in the 1980s were reopened with modern tools and modern thinking. Genealogical DNA was no longer experimental. It was probing the case. Also shattered a dangerous myth. The idea that monsters always look like outsiders. This killer didn't drift through town. He invested in it. He earned trust and wore it like camouflage. That realization changed how future investigations approach community-facing suspects. Familiarity stopped being a shield. For the families, justice arrived late, but it arrived intact. They didn't get answers to every question. No motive was fully explained. No apologies were offered, but they got something just as rare. Certainty. They no longer wondered who took their children or why. The search failed. The unanswered what if lost its power. Grief didn't disappear, but it finally had edges. A shape, a truth to rest against. The farmhouse, where the children were hidden, stands empty now. No sign marks it. No plaque explains what happened there. And maybe that's appropriate, because this case wasn't about a place. It was about time. Time that hid the truth. Time that protected a lie. And time that eventually ran out. Cold cases aren't cold because they're forgotten. They're cold because they're waiting. And this one waited years for the truth to catch up. It always does.